Today we're going to be looking at one of the toughest Dreadnoughts in Warhammer 40k, and that Dreadnought is Bray'Arth Ashmantle, the Salamanders Dreadnought from Forge World. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. So the Sons of Vulcan do have access to a few unique Forge World special characters, and Bray'Arth Ashmantle is one of them. In this video we'll be taking a look at his datasheet, any obvious buffs and synergies that we can see for him on the table, and how I would use him in game. In the background, Sokar Bray'Arth was the former captain of the 4th Company, who sadly fell when he was attacked by the Imgar Gene Stealers, while the Salamanders were purging the moons of their taint. His years of experience had shown him to be an unforgiving and merciless warrior, and though he had clashed many times with the chapter's chapter master over exact approaches, he was granted the privilege to be interred in a Dreadnought chassis. That Dreadnought chassis was one of unusual heritage. Bray'Arth was placed within the Iron Dragon, a relic of the Salamanders said to have been forged by Vulcan himself. Though a noble and powerful relic, the Iron Dragon is a dangerous Dreadnought chassis, and only those with a strong will and individuality can master the sarcophagus without being overcome by its machine spirit. The Dreadnought's shoulder pads were redecorated with Bray'Arth's heraldry, showing him at the moment of his noble self-sacrifice. Bray'Arth obtained the moniker Ashmantle during the fight against the Black Legion and Abhuman rebels in the Khaz'Vareh insurrection. During the battle, he pursued fleeing forces into the sewers beneath the city, and disappeared for 9 days solid, only emerging on smashing his way through of the docked workings, covered every inch in soot, but victorious against the fleeing foe. Since then he's been a bulwark of the Salamanders chapter, and an option of last resort should they need to throw an experienced warrior at the enemy. Bray'Arth is known to have participated in the Bedab War, which only added to his fearsome reputation. Let's see what this combination of ancient relic and crippled space marine can do in battle then, with a look at his impressive datasheet. So as we can see here, Bray'Arth Ashmantle is an HQ choice for the Salamanders, and his rules are found in the Forge World Index for the forces of the Adeptus Astartes. He's certainly not cheap at 325 points, but you get a very mighty stat line for that price tag, as you might expect. Bray'Arth is a Dreadnought with a movement of 6 inches, weapon skill and ballistic skill of 2+, strength 8, and mighty toughness 9, which is a really big deal and makes anti-tank weapons such as las cannons and missile launchers far less effective against him. 8 wounds, 4 attacks, leadership 9, and a 2+ save. His already pretty mighty defense is augmented by the Wrought by Vulcan special rule, meaning that he also has a 5+ invul save, so if you're hit by any AP-4 weapons, you'll still get a 5+. And on top of that, and far more importantly, he also has a 4+ feel no pain type save, so if he loses a wound, you roll the dice, and on the roll of 4 or more, that wound does not count as being lost. Now this last one is absolutely immense. Basically 6+ and 5+ feel no pain type saves are pretty decent in 8th edition, 4+ feel no pain virtually doesn't exist anywhere, and it essentially makes him the equivalent of being double as hard to take down. So this 8 wound Dreadnought with toughness 9 and a 2+ armor save is actually pretty much the equivalent of having 16 wounds. He's really not going down without a fight. On top of this he also has the character keyword, meaning that he won't be able to be targeted unless he's the closest thing to the enemy. So there's a good chance that he's going to get significantly up the board before the enemy can even bring heavy weapons fire to bear on him. He's equipped with 2 Dreadfire claws, each one of which is fitted with a Dreadfire heavy flamer. And on top of that, he may also unleash Burning Wrath on those around him. Those Dreadfire claws, as you might expect, are pretty mighty close combat weapons indeed. They're essentially strength ×2 weapons, so strength 16, AP-4 and a flat damage d6. And of course he'll be getting 5 attacks in normal circumstances due to shock assault, and with those Salamanders rerolls available to reroll any rolls of 1, which is basically the only thing that he's going to be failing at, he will on average do something around 15 wounds to an Imperial Knight on average, if he happens to be engaged with one. With only 5 attacks, however, he just isn't all that strong against infantry. You are going to have to find other ways to deal with hordes. Those Dreadfire heavy flamers are an interesting weapon indeed. They're 8-inch range, heavy d6 and auto hits like the flamers do, but their stat line is heavy 6, AP-2 and a flat damage of 3. So basically any elite infantry are going to get absolutely barbecued by this. On average he'll kill around 3 or 4 Space Marine aggressors if he can get to them, with those innate rerolls. Burning Wrath is kind of a little bit of an extra that can be a way to help deal with hordes when he gets up close to them. It's interestingly a 2-inch range pistol, and it's a 2d6 weapon with strength 4, AP nothing and damage 1, and again it automatically hits the target. In general, you're naturally going to be wanting to fire the Dreadflyer Heavy Flamers instead if he's not in combat, but if he is locked in a protracted combat, then this gives him a weapon to blaze away against some hordes and make sure that he isn't tied down too easily. We already mentioned it, but he does have Angels of Death, giving him that extra attack with Shock Assault, the Salamander's Combat Doctrine to give him extra AP, depending on what phase he's in, and if he is in the Salamander's Tactical Doctrine, he does get +1 to wound with those Dreadfire Heavy Flamers and with the Burning Wrath the pistol, so they do function as the flame weapons as they're obviously intended to be. His main special rule is the Wrought by Vulcan one, but he also has Ancient Beyond Measure, which basically says that he can't be your warlord if there are any other HQs present. I guess he's just a little bit too sleepy and ponderous. He has the Explode special rule, and if he does explode on the 6, then it's D6 mortal wounds for all those around him. So extra good if he goes up in your opponent's lines, but extra bad if he goes up in your lines. Like with all D6 explosions, it could always be worth keeping a CP on standby, just in case you want to nudge it so if he either does or doesn't explode. Finally, he also has smoke launchers, which could be quite relevant on him as his war gear is really quite close range, and I think there are going to be times when he's going to be wanting to move up, but not going to be wanting to fire his weapons because he's out of range of everything. So getting an extra -1 to hit could make this already incredibly tough beast into something even more obnoxious to remove. Overall, Bray'Arth Ashmantle is a good general purpose character Dreadnought, who is quite points expensive but ludicrously tough, and has a pretty decent damage output at short range and when in assault. So what can we do to get more out of Bray'Arth Ashmantle? We've already mentioned that he has some pretty decent synergy with the Promethean cult, getting +1 to his wound rolls with his flame weapons, and getting good use out of those rerolls in close combat and at range. In terms of character support, he honestly doesn't really need a ton of support in terms of characters for rerolls. I know he doesn't have any innately, but with his relatively low number of attacks, the Salamander's rerolls should do you fine, particularly as he's hitting on wounding on 2s in close combat. If you want to make him extra obnoxious to remove, having a Tech Marine around to push D3 wounds back on him could be incredibly infuriating for your opponent, as they're going to have to do an enormous amount of work to try and chip these wounds off one by one. Bray'Arth could be an interesting choice for deploying via a Lucifer pattern drop pod, and it's probably one of the best choices of using this one from Forge World. It does cost a pretty hefty 80 points, but helps to directly address Bray'Arth's major weakness, which is being a little bit slow when getting into combat. Unfortunately, it does mean that he would be out of range of fire with his Dreadfire Heavy Flamers, but frankly turn 1 he is going to be anyway, and at least the drop pod could allow him to get the chance of getting a first turn charge on an unwitting opponent. You could also have the option of swinging him about underneath a Storm Raven. Again, this could be an option to get him right up the board very quickly, although you are putting a lot of very expensive eggs in one basket in that case. In terms of psychic support, the Salamanders have access to Fire Shield and Drakeskin, both of whom can absolutely amp his durability up even further. Being -1 to hit is a really big deal. Having an extra point of toughness is actually only mediocrely good on him, as it's really only going to make a big deal against things that are strength 9 or strength 10. If your opponent has a ton of those, then it maybe could be worth doing, but otherwise it might be better to focus that on your main battle line units. As Bray'Arth Ashmantle is a special character but comes from Forge World, he doesn't actually have a set Warlord trait, so he can be a very solid option if you want to give one of the Salamander's traits to him. A few of the interesting ones are Miraculous Constitution, which you'd only get half of the rule for, but you gain 1 additional wound at the start of your movement phase, and having this guy regenerate lost wounds, as we said, could be incredibly painful for your opponent. Forge Master could be particularly hilarious, as it adds +2 to the toughness, so he could be toughness 11 very easily, and get to the point where he can laugh off most las cannon shots. And Lord of Fire is another very interesting one, and this one allows you to re-roll the dice when determining the number of shots for flame weapons, meaning that those dreaded flamers are going to be even worse. From the main codex, the Imperium's sword isn't a bad pickup. Being able to re-roll charges makes it far more reliable for him to get in, and also +1 attack is a very powerful thing when you're hitting quite this hard. In terms of stratagems, as a really big points intensive unit, he's certainly a decent user of them. As often with Dreadnought, Duty Eternal is possibly one of the most useful ones, as reducing incoming damage only adds extra durability to an already incredibly durable platform, and again will really punish your opponent for trying to take him out. Wisdom of the Ancients can be used either to give him extra rerolls for close combat, or to buff other nearby Salamanders units. You can buff his flame-wielding shooting either with Flamecraft or the Fires of Battle. Potentially you could have an automatic 12 hits from those incredibly intense heavy flamers, and also be getting another 3 mortal wounds on top of any damage output that they give. You could even also combine that with the Crucible of Battle, which is the one for getting +1 to wound, which is really quite powerful on those damage 3 flamers, and combined with the Salamander's Doctrine could actually have them wounding things like Imperial Knights or Leman Russ battle tanks on 3s. If you did stack the stratagems pretty high and used all of these, you could be getting an average of 19 wounds on an Imperial Knight in the shooting phase, let alone any damage that he manages to do to it in close combat when he charges in. He really does quite well with the Salamander's flamey buffs. On top of all the durability that he has, you can also pay 2 command points to have him rise from the ashes, where he can return to battle on the roll of a 4+ with 1 wound remaining. As his weapons auto hit and he has quite such a powerful close combat ability, this could well be worth it to give yourself another turn of having Bray'Arth alive and kicking. Finally, if you did want to clear some hordes in close combat, you can use Immolation Protocols for 1 command point, which makes all flame type weapons in the unit to turn into pistols, which means that he could both fire his Burning Wrath and also his regular enormous heavy flamers into combat in the shooting phase, which could be a decent way of killing some hordes if he is locked up. I believe that this could also be a way to allow him to fire both of those weapons in the shooting phase even if he isn't in combat as well. So you could pay 1 command point to essentially activate 2 additional flamers if he wants to burn some hordes and he's right up close to them. So lots and lots of good stratagems from the Salamanders that this guy can make use of. So how would I go about using Bray'Arth Ashmantle in game then? In general, as a very slow but durable and very deadly unit, you want him to be starting fairly close up front in your deployment zone, but ideally behind some screening units of some kind to frustrate the enemy's biggest guns. If you can use something like Space Marine Scouts or some Infiltrators or Incursors to get into the midfield and shield Bray'Arth from the majority of the enemy army's firepower, then that's certainly a good thing as he moves up. He doesn't need all that much support to be honest, but running him alongside a Tech Marine might not be the worst idea, particularly if you have other Salamander's vehicles for that Tech Marine to fix up. Each movement phase you'd have to make the decision as to whether or not to advance, as it would get him significantly closer to the enemy, but obviously it would preclude him from making any charges, and sometimes it might be a tricky decision as to whether or not you go for the additional advance or try and make a very long charge. Hopefully you should be able to shield him from the first turn or 2, and he should be getting into his damage dealing phase after that, which should mean that his heavy flamers can be in the Salamander's tactical doctrine, making them far more dangerous on rolls to wounds. I strongly consider things like Flamecraft. As we mentioned, he burns things like Imperial Knights pretty darn well, so any infantry out there are just likely to get obliterated. In combat he's going to most want to be targeting enemy characters and heavy hitters, as unless he's shooting them with flamers, he's just not all that efficient against hordes, but if he does get wrapped by hordes, then using Immolation Protocols for that 1 command point to fire both his arm-mounted heavy flamers and the Burning Wrath in one go could very rapidly free him up for another charge. On the defensive side, if your opponent is trying to remove him, then Duty Eternal is pretty much a go-to, and you might well have your opponent firing their entire army at him just to try and take him down. Basically this guy already has a pretty decent combat profile, but he really goes to the next level when you can supply him with a steady stream of stratagems, and he can be very flexible depending on the situation that he's in, whether he needs to turn his flamers up to the max, be extra durable, rise again from the dead, or maybe even fight again in close combat, which I've just remembered we didn't even remember to mention in the stratagems section. Overall, I do think he's a solid choice for Salamander's army, though I would bear in mind that he is pretty points intensive. I think he does face some fairly stiff competition from everyone's favourite chaplain Dreadnought, who is similarly very killy in the fight phase, but can also blaze away with twin las cannons all game, which is exactly what Salamanders want to be doing with those rerolls. You're basically paying a bit of a premium for insane durability and those absolutely godly flamers, so whether or not that's worth the investment is kind of up to you. Let me know your thoughts on Bray'Arth down in the comments below. I've been on the receiving end of those flamers a couple of times, and I can really attest that they go through aggressors in absolutely no time at all. Thanks very much for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. If you'd like to see more, then feel free to subscribe. We have regular 40k content coming out every day. And if you'd like to help out the channel with the creation of new videos, I do have a Patreon link which is in the description below. Basically making all of these videos does take quite a while, so if you are watching regularly, then any support is greatly appreciated. There's a few benefits for Patreons, such as getting some videos early, voting in polls for what comes next to the channel, and the occasional prize draw. If any of that sounds interesting, then please take a look at the link down in the description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.